Welcome to J Life with Daniel. I'm your host, Rabbi Daniel Levine. Okay, well, today on the podcast, we will be talking with Jacob Schwartz. Jacob is currently a graduate student at YU studying social work, and he has a background in recovering from a drug addiction. Jacob, welcome to J Life with Daniel.
Hi, Daniel. How's it going?
It's going great. This is a topic that, I'll be totally honest, I don't know much about, but at the same time, I see just how important this is, both in my work and also just as somebody who is seeing the landscape of America. I was doing a little bit of research before the podcast, and it seems that the rate of addiction in America at any given time is estimated to be between 10 and 20 million people, which is actually a much higher percentage than I would have guessed. So thank you so much for coming on and, talking about all things recovery and everything like that.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. And I think you said something really crucial there, which is there's a lot of, addiction going on and people don't really realize it. The numbers are a lot higher than what we think. A lot of the time people might go through their whole lives without ever meeting someone who has been having an addiction problem. And then they're very shocked when they meet their first person and, almost scandalized or whatever. And other times people grow up their whole lives and many people they know have addiction problems. So I think it ultimately can vary by where you live, the demographics you grew up in. So it really does have a larger footprint on our country and on the world than what a lot of us might have thought.
Yeah, 100%. And I think one of the other angles of here, which we'll probably discuss a little bit later, is that there's sort of aura of tabooness that sort of goes around addiction, where even communities that do struggle with addiction, I feel like there's a sense of trying to sweep it under the rug or trying to imagine this as sort of some outlier when, as the statistics show, it really is affecting, any and every community. And it shouldn't reflect badly on a community or an individual. It just is sort of a fact, just like mental health is a fact, just like physical health is a fact. So again, I really think it's super important to be talking about this. I guess for the first question, so when you sent me your bio, you described yourself as somebody with a recovery background. Can you explain that language and why, what exactly that means to be in recovery?
Yes, totally. So, I think first of all, we use the word in recovery, because it's a process, and people, there's an idea that once you've struggled with a drug addiction, you might be in recovery for the rest of your life. In other words, there's at any given moment a risk that entails of having had a drug addiction where you could get sucked back into it if you don't take the right self-care measures and continue to keep yourself in a better life place than you were at the time when you were using. So basically, that in itself is controversial as well, though, because that kind of connects back to 12-step philosophy and this idea that, once an addict, always an addict is not always agreed upon by many people. And, I've just found that using the language of being in recovery, it takes us away from the language of an addict, which is more of a labeling term. And, that language is stigmatized. People who say this person was an addict or that person was an addict, it's generally said with a stigma attached to it. So that's why I think the recovery community is trying to move in general towards a language of recovery as opposed to a language of addict. Yeah.
That totally makes sense. So if you wouldn't mind going into a little bit of your background, what's sort of your story, anything you feel comfortable sharing?
Totally. Well, I think, my story first starts when I was 15 years old. I was a bit of a nerdy kid when I was 15. And, I basically was at public school. My parents decided, the academics would be better at public school. This is kind of a common thing that, Orthodox Jewish kids go through this. The parents might be like, the Jewish school doesn't have, rigid enough academics. Let's send them to public school. Then they're in public school and say, oh, they're getting too far from their Jewish background. So they switch them back, So basically that happened to me a couple of times, and I was in public school at age 15, a giant Torrey Pines High School, 3,500 students. And I had zero friends or any way of fitting in at all. So basically, I realized that the only way that I was going to, be able to make an instant group of friends was to start smoking pot. So I experimented a little bit with pot. I made some friends in the smoking pot community, and I very quickly I remember almost a week after I smoked pot for the first time, I failed the first test I'd ever failed in my life. I got a 32% on a math test, the Algebra 2 test in ninth grade. And it was or 10th grade. And it was the worst grade I'd ever gotten in my life. And at the time, and this speaks a lot to what it's like inside the mind of an addict, I didn't connect that at all to the fact that I'd been smoking pot. I just I viewed it as like, wonder why I did so bad on that math. But anyhow, that's when I first started to smoke a little weed. And, especially nowadays, you'll see a lot of people who say, what's wrong with weed? Weed's not addictive. Weed doesn't cause problems. I'll say it like this, weed isn't a problem for everyone who does it. There's people who do it and it's not a problem for them. That said, almost everyone I've ever met who had a substance addiction problem, they started out with weed in some way, or they did it at the beginning, or it was a gateway drug for them, and that term is loaded nowadays. It's kind of, people don't like that term so much, gateway drug, but I do believe that marijuana is a gateway drug for many people, and it was for me. Anyway, I did some marijuana at first, and basically, it was a little ironic how this all went down. My parents discovered that I'd smoked marijuana very quickly after I started it, and they started to give me drug tests to see if I would be smoking marijuana. I realized that I couldn't smoke marijuana anymore because I was taking the drug tests. And around the same time, my parents moved me to a Jewish school, Sky High, mostly because I was saying that I didn't feel like I had any friends at the public school. And also
just for some background for listeners, so we actually went to high school together. Sky High is the modern Orthodox school in San Diego.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I went to Sky High because the vaccatory plans was going bad, because I was starting to smoke pot. One way or another, there was other reasons I went to Sky High. I was really missing that small, friendly, warm environment of a small Jewish school, which was very good for me in many ways. And in many ways, in the last 3 years of high school, it was one of the best years of my life, and I felt really safe and welcome. And that helped me from spiraling more out of control than I would have if I had stayed in public school, I'm sure. And I did spiral quite out of control right after high school. But anyhow, back to that first little time when I started to get the drug test as a young adult. I realized I would have to take drugs that didn't show up on the drug test. So the background question is, why was I trying to get high? And for many years, I had no answer to that. I had no idea why I wanted to use drugs so bad. I just knew from the moment I first tried marijuana that I always wanted to be high, and I felt like it was an identity for me as well. I was able to connect to people based on it, and I was able to transcend my identity of being a nerdy, outcast kind of, Jew who'd been in public school, and, to being someone who could become instant friends with anyone who was also into drugs, and then that's one of the dangerous sides about drugs, because it gives people an identity as well. And that's something people have to realize when they're in recovery. You have to build a whole new identity for yourself, because drugs were not just an addiction, they were an identity as well. Yeah.
Gotcha. Yeah, no, that is really powerful in terms of the identity part. And I mean, so much of what I end up talking about just in my work, albeit not directly about the issues of drugs and addiction, but just is the need for identity. And I think we are going through a crisis. And, I have talked about this in past podcast episodes of people that are seeking out identity. And I think that one of the problems, I mean, this is sort of a side tangent critique of mine, but I think that we're in a world now where in some ways people are losing their identity, because I think a lot of particularist identities are sort of under attack by just sort of mainstream liberal values that preach, which I mostly agree with, but preach, everybody's the same. Why do we need boundaries? Why do we need groups? But then the problem is humans really do strive for identity. And if all the quote unquote positive identities are taken away and, oh, those are obsolete, we don't need those anymore, that opens the door for other types of identity, be it political extremism, religious extremism, or something like this. So that's really powerful. So you went from public school, you switched over to yeshiva high school. And what then happened after you graduated high school?
When I finished high school, I went to a year in Israel for yeshiva. And for most of high school, I didn't use drugs. I was mostly sober throughout high because it's very hard to get away with using drugs while you're living with your parents once they've noticed that you're using. So that was a good thing. Anyhow, when I finished high school, I went to a year in Israel. And basically, for my first couple months of my year in Israel, I was very much using mostly just the stimulant medications that I was prescribed. So, I have ADHD. The doctors gave me Adderall from a pretty young age. So basically, I believe that's tied into my addiction problems as well. It's not a popular opinion per se, but I do believe that for people predisposed towards having addiction problems, taking stimulant medication is a no-go. And that's basically clinically accepted nowadays is, people who have been in rehab are in rehab. They don't give them stimulants 99% of the time because they are addictive to those people, even though other people without addiction problems might never feel that kind of relationship with their stimulant medication. Anyway, I mostly took a lot of stimulants when I was in Israel at the beginning, and I very quickly got into other drugs in Israel. I found some marijuana, and then I started to take LSD and Xanax, which I got from various sources. I started to become very psychotic. After a few months in Israel, I was basically in another mental space that was very, scary in hindsight. But I felt like everything was perfect at the time, but I was very much out of whack. So that year in Israel was very messy. I got kicked out of my first yeshiva that I was at after about 3 months there because somebody told me that I'd been taking Xanax, and it was pretty obvious because I was sleeping half the day. And then later on, I went to a new yeshiva, and in that yeshiva, I was sober for a month or two, and then quickly got back to what I was doing. I mean, I would say I wasn't able to keep sober for a long time until I reached age 21. And that was mostly because I didn't have any reason to be sober before that. I had no self-esteem, no desire to live, really. I just kind of got through the day doing whatever I had to do to get to the next day. I didn't have any goals or a belief of self-efficacy or a belief that I could actualize any of my goals. So those were all things that played in later when I went into recovery, was getting those skills, getting skills about goal achieving, self-esteem. I'd say self-esteem and self-efficacy were the two biggest forces which allowed me to start being in recovery.
Yeah, and that's really powerful. Going back for a second. So this whole time, I guess 0 to 21, you are in the Orthodox community. You spent 3 years in Orthodox high school and then another, it seems like, year plus around a couple of different Orthodox yeshivot. What is it like being addicted to drugs in the wider Jewish and more specifically in the Orthodox community? Do you think that this was despite being in the Orthodox community? Was this because you were in the Orthodox community? Do you sort of view the Orthodox, environment that you were in as sort of just an extraneous factor that doesn't have anything to do with the addiction?
That's a good question. I think it's somewhere between the first and the third thing you said. I think it's kind of like, I don't think it was connected to the fact that I was Orthodox that I started to use drugs or that I remained addicted to them. In fact, I think my religious practices were one of the core things which allowed me to rise beyond my addiction at a certain point. And to this day, I rely heavily on my Orthodox religious practices and values to stay clean. That said, I know there's many people who that wouldn't be the case for, and somebody who grows up in the Orthodox community and feels stifled and by it and feels like it goes against what they believe, it could very much be at risk of developing a substance addiction if they are also have other negative factors, lack protective factors, to prevent them from self-harm. I'd say that, being in these Orthodox environments and also being on drugs, it was very interesting because I'd say most of the time people would try and pretend like it wasn't happening. Between adults and other kids, it was mostly just a matter of, I would just kind of do it in secret, and, whether people knew or not, they would look the other way, except for my parents, who were always trying to get me to stop whenever they knew that I was using. So, the main relationship between my addiction and my religious faith, I think, is basically just this constant internal struggle of like, I think that I'm not being my best self right now. And I know that Judaism wants me to be my best self. And I know that my addiction is keeping me in a bad place, but I'm stuck here. So it became a lot of like, almost like a Hasidic journey of like, of a lot of like Rabbi Nachman type teachings of like, might fall down hard, but you can pick yourself up, in the darkness, there is light. I found a lot of strength in teachings like that because I felt like I was in a dark place, but I didn't have anywhere near the amount of enormous willpower that it takes to pull yourself out of an addiction at that point in my life.
You had said something really powerful to me before we started recording, which was that in the Orthodox world, you constantly felt like you were doing something that you called the sin by using. Can you expand on that a little bit and sort of how that connected to your religious identity and your religious journey?
Yeah, I'd say a lot of it was the insanity. We talk about in the recovery world, we talk about the insanity of using and how there is an insanity that comes with using drugs because of just the overactivity of the addicted brain as it tries to feverishly rationalize continued use in the face of, horrific consequences. And, I would say that multiplied by a religious, mental framework, it just became probably more insane than it was for the average addict, between, not only was I beating myself up for using, I was beating myself up for transgressing against God, against my soul, against myself, and at the same time, I would be using my religious beliefs to rationalize my addiction by telling myself, hey, I could be doing worse sins that are actually against the Torah. The Torah doesn't directly say you can't use drugs, so on a day-to-day basis, I would have a different connection between my addiction and my faith. But at any given point, it was usually one of two polarities. What I'm doing is a sin, or what I'm doing is a better alternative than what other sins there are that I could be doing.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. So to continue your story, so you were in Israel, you were in a couple of different yeshivot, and at that time you said that you had sort of lost touch with reality. What were sort of the next steps there?
When I lost touch with reality, I ended up going to the second yeshiva, and it was very much like I was wandering through this, Israel year in a phase of like, psychotic beliefs and believing that, I could, I just kind of felt like taking a lot of psychedelics strips away the distinction between the real world and the spiritual realms, and as a religious Jew believing in spiritual realms, I felt like I was like seeing into other dimensions, and that kind of belief can really make a person act crazy and be crazy. So it gave me a good insight, which I'm able to use later into what it's like for people who are experiencing paranoid breakdowns and psychotic delusions, in my practice, I've been able to, work with people who are experiencing psychoses and, episodes of delusions, and with the understanding of the fact that for someone experiencing paranoia and delusions, that is absolutely real to them. It doesn't seem like they have no consciousness of the fact that that's not real. And in fact, if someone tries to tell them that what they're seeing or experiencing is not real, that will make them even more paranoid or delusional, because that person is just trying to, convince them that everything's okay so that they will, relax, and then the bad thing that they're worried about can happen. So, I have a lot of insight into what it's like to have that kind of mind state. And I'm grateful I was able to come back from it, because it is very scary. And, lots of people, they go there and they don't come back. So I consider myself lucky and blessed that I was able to come back from being psychotic at multiple points in my life due to drugs, always due to drugs.
100%. So before getting to the next part of your story, I think we're at sort of a crucial inflection point. It seems like I can imagine that a lot of people listening to this podcast are different types of rabbis, educators, parents, community leaders, people in the community that, again, as we talked about before, this is not an issue that's relegated to one type of person or one part of the community. There's probably also a lot of people I can imagine that are in my shoes right now, which is somebody who certainly has had friends and students that are in this situation and has never really received any professional training on this issue specifically. what sort of worked for you? What was able to, who were the people, what were the organizations, what were the ideas that allowed you to come personally to the journey inflection point where you wanted to start trying to quit?
Yes. I'd say the truth is, and it's very hard. It's a very hard truth for people who have not had addictions themselves to understand, but there's nothing you can do to help an addict quit except for just support them and just make sure they don't die until they're ready to quit, because they will reach a point where they don't want to use anymore for whatever reason. And until then, anything you say to them, anything you try and do to help them, it will be ineffective. I mean, and beyond ineffective, it might make them lash out against you. It might make them not trust you ever again, and it's a very hard thing to say, because, there's an impulse that we want to help these people and do everything we can. And, often in my past, I saw, good, well-meaning people who wanted to drop everything and spend a week or two trying to get me fixed, but you just can't do that for someone who has an addiction. It's like they're in quicksand, and you can't, they have to pull themselves out, and that's probably a bad analogy because you would pull someone out of the quicksand, but you can't really do that for someone who's in, an addictive place. They have to pull themselves out, and you can give them a hand to help pull themselves out. I guess the better analogy.
Does that include situations like, I don't want to say coercing, but strongly pushing people into rehab centers and other places like that? You would say that, your opinion is that, if there's a high school or a college student, a parent or an educator shouldn't try to push in that direction?
I don't know if I'd say that. I'd say I'll say it this way. Everyone who has an addiction problem, they should be coerced into going to rehab one time so that they can get a foundation or an idea about the fact that recovery exists and that there's options for them if they want to get clean. After that point, pushing them back to rehab again and again when they're not ready to quit is a waste of time. That first time, though, it can get a lot of people clean, and it can also plant the seed for people to return to later on. So it's mostly about planting a seed, especially with younger people who are only in their teens or early 20s. The odds are they're going to keep using for a while, and you just have to do everything you can to make sure they don't die, use a lot of harm reduction, and give them the tools that they'll need to use to get themselves clean in time. And I'd say the most valuable supports that I had when I was ever using in my life were the people who I felt unconditional acceptance and love from, and who would not try and talk to me about what I was doing at the time if I didn't want to talk about it. And if I did, I would know that those people I could talk to, but trying to kind of walk up to someone who's in the middle of an addiction and without having already a strong rapport with them and just trying to relate to them on the basis of wanting to help them fix their problem is probably not going to do very much.
Yeah. And I think that's really important, because that is totally non-intuitive, I think, for the average person that has never dealt with this. And, I even see, I've talked to parents who have had children that are in this situation, and, just all instincts and all educator and parental intuition is to do exactly what you just said not to do. So I think it is important to sort of highlight that. What was for you the impetus? Was there a single moment when you were in Israel that you decided that you wanted to start the path to recovery? Was there just a myriad of factors? Was there some outside force?
I mean, it was a myriad of factors. And I think that even after just a short bout of using drugs, it just brings a lot of exhaustion to the soul and a lot of disturbance and internal conflict, and people get tired of that. The drugs, they stop working, they wear off, and the tolerance gets higher, and the internal tolerance to dealing with the state of being addicted gets lower, and that together reaches the point of a person becoming ready to stop. And the thing that must be known about that point when they're ready to stop is that might not last forever, but it will last for long enough to set some bedrock down for building that foundation of what will eventually become a lasting, power of recovery. But, you have to let the baby steps happen, because for someone who's never been sober before and is just doing it their first time. They're going to make mistakes and they're going to relapse most likely. And it's not good to set these too high expectations of they're not ever going to fall after they get clean the first time. The reality is, as providers for people in recovery, we recognize that relapse is part of the process and it's going to happen, multiple times on average for most people until they get it down. And for me, between the spiritual exhaustion of using, the constant pressure from my family to stop using, which was a double-edged sword. It wasn't good for me psychologically, but it also motivated me to go to rehab. So do with that what you will. To this day, I still have conflicted feelings about whether that was good for me or not. But it did end up getting me into Beit Teshuva one way or another. And that was where I started my journey towards recovery. It took me a year of sitting in Beit Teshuva and feeling depressed and doing absolutely nothing all day until I started to actually do the work myself to build up my self-esteem and get something going with my life. And that was able to snowball into me going to Berkeley and making the kind of changes I needed to make. But I was able to get there because of a combination of my own conscience reactivating throughout the haze of drugs and continued prodding by family members, as well as just the sense that I wanted to make something of my life and stop suffering, because it does feel like suffering. People who are addicted to drugs are suffering, and people might not see it that way. They see them as being selfish or not caring about the people in their lives. But it's always important to have that consciousness that, they might seem like the most selfish person ever using and not caring about their family, but they are 100% suffering and struggling with a real mental disease.
Yeah, 100%. So you went from Israel to Beit Teshuva, which, just for some background, is an LA-based Jewish rehab center. You were there for how many years?
I was there for 18 months.
You were there for 18 months. And what does it mean to be a Jewish rehab center? Is it just, I'm almost picturing, when people say that Israel is a Jewish state and, you have as many different definitions there as you do citizens in Israel, what exactly does it mean that to be a Jewish rehab center?
That is a good question. I think Beit Teshuva's idea of what it was to be a Jewish rehab center was that they had a Jewish philosophy built into their recovery curriculum, and very well executed, and a very unique program was being offered at Beit Teshuva, which had Jewish ideals, especially, Jewish exodus ideals, Jewish self-change and reflection ideals, and the idea of teshuva, of, fixing, returning yourself to your ideal self, getting back on track. These ideas were built into, their daily groups and the message that they would give there. And there was also a Jewish community at the core of the rehab there. So it wasn't just people at this rehab who were in recovery and their counselors working with them and their therapists and their psychiatrists and everything. There was actually also a group of just average, ordinary people, about 50 of them, who were the synagogue, as it were, of Beit Teshuva. And they also would come there for Shabbat services, and they would, sponsor the people who were at Beit Teshuva's treatment, so that a lot of them didn't have to pay if they couldn't afford it, or, people would pay less. So it was a religious institution as well as a rehab center. Yeah.
Gotcha. And so then, just to sort of finish the story before some questions at the end. So you left Beit Teshuva, then you went to UC Berkeley. You graduated a year and a half ago.
Yes.
And now you're almost finished a master's in social work. What are next steps? What are you looking to do career-wise?
Basically, now I'm, I came to a realization quickly after I left Berkeley, which was the history of addiction follows a person no matter what they do in their life. And it might be perceived as a bad thing. People might think that, oh, it shouldn't be that way, but that doesn't change the fact that it is that way. Once people know that you were an addict at some point, they're not ever going to forget it. They're going to talk about it. They're going to tell other people about it. And it's going to follow you throughout your life, even if you're doing 100% well. And you could be, doing 1,000% in terms of giving back to your community, being your best self, working achieving in all the conventional ways and in your own personal ways and being successful in whatever that means to you. And that still wouldn't change the fact that people are going to remember that you had a history of addiction, and that will prevent you from getting certain kinds of jobs. That'll prevent you from doing certain kinds of things with your life. And what I realized was I can't run from my history of addiction because people know about it. And if they don't know about it, I'm just going to be worried that they're going to find out about it. And so I just have to go into a clear path, which will allow me to draw on my history of addiction and put it in a central featured place of my career instead of hiding it or pretending like it didn't happen or trying to say, oh, that was a long time ago. I'm not like that anymore. What I can say is, yeah, that was a long time ago. I'm not like that anymore, but I'm also happy in a way that happened because it got me to where I'm at today, allowing me to help other people who have this problem, and it gave me a unique ability to understand people going through, suffering in mental health situations. And it brought me to a, life calling,
Yeah, that is really sad and upsetting to hear that, you felt that there were certain things that you were, blacklisted from and things like that, even just the most fundamental, Jewish idea of personal autonomy. I mean, connected to the idea of teshuvah, which is Jewish tradition does believe that individuals do have the ability to change their own fortune in a very fundamental way that actually distinguishes Judaism from a lot of other traditions in terms of just how much power we reserve for people's choices and free will and autonomy there. If you don't mind me asking, and I don't mean to put you on the spot, what specific types of things did you feel like you weren't able to do because of this background?
I guess there's just this idea of, I have a history of addiction and people are talking about it. And some people might say that's just in your head, but I feel like, there's just certain things that I intuitively knew that people wouldn't want me to be, doing. I guess the number one thing that you think of is people who have addiction problems. People don't understand that. They think that it makes them a dangerous person, especially if they're in recovery or they're not doing that anymore. That shouldn't be where your mind is going, that, oh, I can't have this person around my kids, or I can't have this person, in a teaching role and stuff like that. That kind of thing. It depends on where a person is at. And if we really believe in the ideal of teshuvah, we should be trusting the person and believing that they are in a better place than they were, and at the end of the day, I think the stigma of addiction is not going anywhere fast. It's still out there and it's very present. And any type of jobs or roles where people feel like are sensitive, where they need to trust the person to do it perfectly, or where there could be high stakes involved, like there's, kids involved, etc. That's when you'll see people who will not hire you if you have a history of addiction, or at least they'll put you at the bottom of the list, because there's going to be other people who are less complicated of a hire, in that kind of situation.
What do you think? What do you think is needed to break the stigma? I'm thinking, I'm very proud at Temple Beth Tikva, one of the synagogues in Orange County that I work at. During Shabbat morning, when we say the Mishu Beirach, we specifically say also for anybody struggling with addiction, which is something that, I don't know how prominent that is in liberal / non-Orthodox synagogues, but I was quite impressed to see that. I don't know who started that tradition or whether or not that's, standardized across, different non-Orthodox synagogues, but what specifically in your mind, what is needed to break the sort of taboo, both in the Jewish community and also just wider society?
I think that's a really great tradition. I really like that, and I always have myself just added in names of people who I know are struggling with addiction whenever we do our Mishu Beirach in synagogue. And I like the fact that that's specified as, a illness that people are struggling with. Because I think the more we recognize addiction as a mental illness and we equate it towards other mental issues and, mental problems, that people are struggling with, the more we take it away from this idea of it's a person's choice to be an addict, they're choosing to bother their family and create negative, damage everywhere they go. We need to get away from that idea of a person is doing this by choice. And I think that's where the stigma comes from. It's this old idea that addicts are choosing to just, squander their lives and, damage their bodies for fun, or because they just don't care about anyone else or about themselves. And that's not true. Addicts do that because it's a directly traceable neurological problem, and that's why they do it. And it has nothing to do with their morals. So to break stigma, we need to move away from a moral view of addiction. And that's why the 12-step program is a little dangerous in of itself, from my perspective, because it is essentially a moral view of addiction. And it does mention that addiction is a disease, which is a good thing, but it also has many moralistic aspects to it. So my answer to defeating stigma and diffusing it is we need to move away from a moralistic paradigm of viewing addiction.
And you think that moralistic paradigm is still operative? Certainly it's operative in sort of wider society, but even still in the treatment world, it's also that's still what's used?
Yes, and it's very widely spread still in the treatment world. It will be, I would say it this much, you can go to 5 treatment centers in a day and it'll be different at each one. One of them will still be like fully moralizing addiction for all of its clients. Another one will have a fully evidence-based, disease model perspective where they won't be moralizing anyone. Then you'll go to another place where sometimes they'll be like saying contradicting stuff. Like they'll sometimes be saying, hey, you need to stop hurting your friends and family. How are you going to make a choice to be better? Which is a moralizing perspective, because it's saying that you're making a choice to be an addict. And then at the same time, it'll also teach about the disease model and how, your brain is being overridden by, your dopamine and glutamate processes. And it's a contradicting message that we're giving addicts at a lot of these places, where we're saying there's a moral aspect to this, but also, we recognize that you're struggling with a neurological problem.
Yeah, no, that totally makes sense. And that tension there seems really tough, honestly, to be in an environment like that, where you have these completely opposite ideas, getting thrown at you. So we have just a couple more questions left. And then, if you have any, final thoughts, you can definitely share whatever.
Sure.
I'll just ask, two questions at once, because they're connected. If anybody's listening to this podcast and they're struggling with substance abuse, do you have any either practical or theoretical words of wisdom or advice?
Yeah, so for anyone who is struggling with addiction right now, my advice would be that it's all about just doing one thing each day that makes you feel proud of yourself, that builds up that sense of self-esteem and that sense of self-efficacy. If you're not ready to go to rehab yet, you're not ready to go to rehab yet. If you're not ready to go to groups yet, you're not ready to go to groups yet. But the one thing you can do, no matter where you're at, is just each day start building up that self-care practice. Do that one thing that's going to make you feel like you're proud of who you are today. And that's really going to do a lot in the long run. It might not change anything today, might not change anything tomorrow, but just add one thing to your calendar each day and do that thing. And that sense of accountability to yourself, that sense of self-efficacy and self-esteem, that'll really snowball into helping you get that willpower that you need to start changing your life.
And same question, but what would you say for people who are very close to somebody who's struggling with addiction, parent, rabbi, educator, teacher, anything of that sort?
I'd say it's hard. You're doing one of the hardest things that there is. And if the person's in active addiction, you really need to just do whatever you can to turn your attention towards other things. You need to, start a hobby if you don't have one already. Focus yourself on your own self-care and your own work, and take yourself out of that codependency with that addict as best as you can, because they're going to drag you down if you let yourself become enmeshed with everything they're doing, or you probably already are doing that. So you need to pull back from that in whatever ways you can. And, with your therapist, work on that, with your own self, work on that. Either way, the worst thing for both parties is letting that codependency continue to thrive and get out of control. So it's important to really give yourself a chance to live your own life now that you've been fixating on the addict for so long.
And what about situations where, you sort of framed it as codependent, but, the relationship of a parent and child, or let's say siblings, not necessarily codependent, but just sort of in a situation where they're just desperate to see their loved one get help? I know we touched on it a little bit before, but just any practical or again, more theoretical advice for somebody who say their older sibling or their child is going through addiction, and they're just, they're willing to do whatever it takes. They just, are oftentimes, misguided and end up doing something that even might make the situation worse because they're so, excited is the wrong word, but so zealous to get help, even if it's, at the detriment of the person struggling.
Again, I think you said it all right there. There is no way to really help that person unless you are letting them take the lead. And so until they're ready to take the lead on helping themselves, you have to go against all your instincts and pull back from trying to do the most to help them, because it's not going to help, and if they ask you for help, then that's totally different. And there's 100 things I could tell you to do for that person once they ask you for help. But until you guys are on the same page about getting that person the help that they need, then these efforts are just going to strain the relationship further and not help the person because they're not ready to make the change.
Yeah. Well, Jacob, I've known you for probably 15 to 20 years at this point. I just want to say you're such an awesome person, such an inspirational story, truly. Both for, certainly the people who have known you for 15, 20 years. And I'm sure for people who will meet you, you're obviously going to be, an ideal person for going into this exact space, helping people. Before we wrap up this podcast, anything else that we didn't touch on, any other thoughts, any tangents that, you were sort of hoping to discuss?
I would say just, it's really hard to say exactly the right thing when you're talking about addiction. And that's because there's so much stigma around it, and there's so much pain at the core of this issue. And, everyone has to have a lot of patience with the people who are dealing with people who have addicts in their lives and with the addicts themselves, because you just have to recognize that this is not a petty issue. It's like one of the worst, situations that a person or a family can deal with. So, understanding and patience for everybody involved in the field, both, people who are going through it, people who are helping the people going through it, and, the people who are affected by it because they have family members struggling, and that's crucial. And self-care is what it all comes back to. I'd say the number one thing that got me out of my addiction was beginning to maintain a serious self-care practice. And, if people do that, they will be protecting themselves against potentially getting into an addictive pattern. And they could even pull themselves out of an addictive pattern by just doing enough to practice their own self-care, boost their self-esteem, and improve their self-advocacy. So definitely just working on that is important for all people.
Well, Jacob, thank you so much for coming on the podcast and sharing all of your words of wisdom.
Sure. Thank you, Dan. I appreciate it. It was great being here. And thank you so much for speaking to me today.